I came home expecting to thank my son for restoring our old family barn. Instead, he proudly showed me every repaired beam except one wall. When I asked about it, he smiled and quietly said, "I sealed it for good." The problem was, my father once told me that walls should never disappear. If he had protected it his entire life, why would my own son bury it forever? If you've ever trusted someone enough to improve what you loved, stay with me for a little while. For several moments I simply stood inside the freshly restored barn. The smell of new pine mixed with the familiar scent of old hay. Sunlight poured through windows that hadn't opened properly in years. The roof no longer leaked. The warped floor had been carefully leveled. Every weathered beam looked stronger than I remembered. Daniel had done beautiful work. That was what made the sealed wall impossible to ignore. During 28 years supervising construction projects with the Army Corps of Engineers, I learned something that mattered long before blueprints reached a job site. When every damaged section receives careful restoration except one, someone usually has a reason for treating that section differently. Daniel noticed me studying the wall. "I figured you'd ask about it." I probably would. It wasn't safe anymore. Technically possible, emotionally incomplete. The old cavity behind it had started collapsing. So I framed over it and sealed everything before rebuilding the interior. He spoke calmly. Nothing about his face suggested dishonesty, but neither did it explain why he had removed every trace of the original opening. I nodded politely. "You've worked hard. I wanted to surprise you." "You certainly did." Visible relief crossed his face. He expected disappointment, not acceptance. Before leaving the barn, I slowly walked its entire length. Every support post remained where my father had placed it decades earlier. Every loft ladder, every feed bin, every original timber brace, except one. The sealed wall carried lumber much newer than the rest of the structure. The replacement boards weren't simply repaired, they intentionally erased whatever had existed there before. That evening, I unlocked the old steel filing cabinet inside my farmhouse office. Construction permits, survey drawings, insurance maps, receipts my father never threw away. Near the bottom rested one rolled construction sketch labeled in his handwriting, "North Interior Wall." The drawing showed the exact section Daniel had sealed. Behind it appeared a narrow enclosed chamber. No storage shelves, no feed racks, only one handwritten note beside the hidden space. "Never remove, not repair, not replace, never remove." The following morning, my grandson Caleb stopped by before school. "Dad says the barn looks better than ever." "It does." He pointed toward an old photograph hanging beside my desk. "Weren't there little wooden doors on that wall?" I turned toward the picture. He was right. The photograph clearly showed a small concealed doorway exactly where the sealed wall now stood. For the first time since returning home, I stopped wondering what might have been hidden behind the wall. Instead, I began wondering why someone wanted the doorway itself to disappear from the family's memory. I rolled my father's construction sketch back into its tube without mentioning it to Daniel. Some questions deserved evidence before they deserved accusations. During 28 years supervising construction projects for the Army Corps of Engineers, I learned another lesson that rarely failed. When one revised blueprint contradicted the original, the purchasing records usually explained why. The following afternoon, Daniel stopped by carrying a small wooden toolbox. I found this tucked behind one of the old feed bins. Inside rested my father's framing square, a worn carpenter's pencil, and the brass folding rule he carried every day until arthritis finally slowed his hands. You could have kept these. They weren't mine to keep. Technically true, emotionally reassuring. For several minutes we talked about roofing shingles, fencing repairs, and the old maple tree beside the barn. Neither of us mentioned the sealed wall. Finally, I asked as casually as I could, "Did you replace much lumber on the north side?" He hesitated, only briefly. "More than I expected. The old framing couldn't safely support the repairs." Another careful answer, not dishonest, but strangely incomplete. Instead of pressing him further, I thanked him for everything he had done. Visible relief crossed his face. He believed I had accepted his explanation. After he left, I unlocked another drawer inside my farmhouse office. My father had kept every receipt longer than anyone I had ever known. Fence wire, nails, paint, concrete, timber. One bundle tied with faded twine immediately caught my attention. North Barn Renovation. The receipt stretched across nearly 15 years. Every timber purchase listed identical dimensions, except one. A shipment ordered the same week. My father drew the construction sketch described something unusual. Rough-cut oak planks, interior partition only. Partition, not support wall, not structural repair. Another carefully chosen phrase. That evening, I opened one of my father's handwritten farm journals. Most pages described rainfall, livestock, harvest yields, and equipment repairs. Near the middle of one notebook, a single sentence had been underlined twice. Never measure the north wall by its thickness alone. Thickness, not strength, not height. Another carefully chosen word. I turned the page expecting an explanation. There wasn't one. Only a rough pencil drawing showing the concealed doorway Caleb had noticed in the old photograph. Beside the sketch appeared one recurring date, October 12th. The same date appeared again and again, always October 12th, never any other day. The pattern quietly settled into my thoughts. The hidden chamber followed a schedule, not maintenance, a purpose. The next morning, I visited the county building office to review the original barn permits. Every foundation measurement matched, every roof revision, every drainage improvement. One notation immediately caught my attention. North interior partition, existing historical feature. Existing, not temporary, not obsolete. Another carefully chosen phrase. The permit carried my father's signature from 31 years earlier. Driving home, disappointment slowly gave way to curiosity. For the first time since Daniel proudly showed me the restored barn, I stopped wondering whether he had accidentally erased part of our family's history. Instead, I began wondering whether my father had quietly built that hidden partition to protect something far more important than the barn itself. For the next several days, I behaved exactly the way Daniel expected. I stopped asking about the sealed wall. I thanked him again for restoring the barn. I even complimented the craftsmanship of the new roof and the repaired loft. He smiled every time we talked, not because the mystery had disappeared, because he believed I had stopped chasing it. During 28 years supervising construction projects for the Army Corps of Engineers, I learned another lesson that solved more problems than any engineering manual ever could. The moment people believed you had stopped studying the plans, they stopped protecting the revisions. That became my strategy. On Tuesday morning, I visited the County Historical Preservation Office. Sarah Whitmore greeted me before I reached the archive desk. "I wondered when you'd come." "You expected me?" "I expected the north wall to bring you here." "Not if." "When?" Without another word, she unlocked a narrow records room beneath the courthouse. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Historic farm surveys, barn restoration files, agricultural preservation reports, church property records. Sarah carefully removed one slim binder labeled Rural Community Relief Program. Not agricultural grants, not historical restoration. Relief. The word quietly settled into my thoughts. Inside rested inspection notes dating back nearly 40 years. Every October 12th carried the same handwritten notation. North Chamber prepared. Prepared. Not repaired. Not inspected. Another carefully chosen word. I looked toward Sarah. What exactly was being prepared? She hesitated. The records answer that. Technically honest. Emotionally unfinished. Instead of pressing her further, I quietly turned another page. Tucked beneath one inspection report rested an old black and white photograph. My father stood beside the concealed doorway with 3 local church volunteers loading plain wooden crates into the hidden chamber. No farm equipment, no livestock supplies, only carefully stacked boxes marked with simple handwritten labels. Winter relief. For the first time since Daniel sealed the wall. My first conclusion quietly collapsed. The hidden chamber had never existed to protect family property. Driving home, another realization settled into my thoughts. If church volunteers gathered there every October, then whatever mattered most had always existed beyond the chamber itself. That afternoon, I unlocked one of my father's old cedar trunks stored in the farmhouse attic. Between weathered seed catalogs and faded land surveys rested a spiral notebook I had never seen before. Not his farm journal, not construction notes, a church relief ledger. Across the inside cover, he had written only 6 words. Open after the wall is sealed. Not after my death. Not after the barn is restored. After the wall is sealed. For several long moments, I simply held the notebook without opening it. Then, another folded document slipped onto the floor. A county archive access card. Its issue date matched every October 12th, recorded inside Sarah's preservation binder. The sealed wall was no longer leading me toward a forgotten construction mystery. It was quietly leading me toward a humanitarian mission my father had apparently protected for decades, one he never intended to remain hidden forever. I carried my father's church relief ledger home without opening it. Some promises deserved the same patience as the people who had quietly protected them. For years I believed the hidden chamber inside our old barn had been another example of my father's careful craftsmanship. Now I wasn't certain it had ever been built to protect the barn itself. During 28 years supervising construction projects for the Army Corps of Engineers, I learned another lesson that quietly prevented more costly mistakes than any structural inspection. The strongest wall in a building rarely existed to carry the greatest weight. Sometimes it existed to protect the reason the building mattered. That evening, I spread every clue across the kitchen table. The original construction sketch, the timber purchase receipts, my father's farm journals, the county preservation binder. The unopened church relief ledger rested quietly in the center. Every document repeated the same idea: preparation, not construction. The following morning, I finally opened the ledger. Inside rested only one handwritten page. No financial records, no inventory lists. Only one sentence written in my father's familiar block lettering: "If the wall is ever sealed, don't ask what it hides. Ask who it protected." I read the words twice, then a third time. The mystery quietly changed. The hidden chamber wasn't protecting supplies. Someone had depended upon it. Later that morning, Sarah Whitmore invited me back to the county preservation office. She wasn't waiting in the archive room. She stood inside a small exhibit documenting the history of rural churches throughout our county. "I think you're finally ready." She carefully unrolled a large preservation map. Across the faded paper stretched several locations connected by handwritten lines: our family barn, the old church, the county grain warehouse, a railroad loading platform. Every route ended at one place: the hidden chamber. "It was never simply part of the barn," Sarah said quietly. "It never was." Technically complete, emotionally unfinished, she pointed toward one faded notation written in my father's handwriting: "Community Relief Station, station, not storage, not workshop." Another carefully chosen phrase. Sarah quietly explained that during several devastating harvest failures decades earlier, local churches quietly organized emergency food, seed grain, warm clothing, and livestock medicine for struggling farm families. The hidden chamber became the secure collection point before supplies could be distributed privately. No family was embarrassed. No public lists were posted. Only quiet dignity, driving home every earlier conclusion quietly collapsed. The wall had never protected a secret room. The barn itself had quietly become part of a much larger act of compassion. That afternoon, Harold Bishop presented the preliminary county heritage inspection plan. One recommendation immediately caught my attention: remove undocumented interior alterations before certification. The exact proposal Sarah feared. I attended the meeting without asking a single question. Harold smiled when he noticed me. "I'm glad you came. I've had time to think. I hoped you would." He believed I had accepted the sealed wall as nothing more than a practical renovation. Strategic surrender quietly lowered every remaining defense around him. As the committee members packed away inspection folders, one thick preservation binder slipped onto the floor. Several pages scattered across the room. I helped gather them. Most contained inspection schedules. One carried a heading I had never seen before: Historic Humanitarian Site Review. Across the bottom, 3 words had been stamped in blue ink: supporting authorization required. Required, not recommended, not optional. For the first time since returning home, I understood the real deadline. The county heritage inspection wasn't simply deciding whether our barn deserved preservation. It would determine whether my father's quiet relief mission remained part of local history, or disappeared forever behind one perfectly reasonable administrative decision. 5 days remained before the county heritage inspection. 5 days before my father's quiet relief mission would either become a permanent part of local history or disappear beneath an ordinary administrative decision. I spread every document across the old oak table inside the farmhouse office, the original construction sketch, the timber purchase records, my father's farm journals, the church relief ledger, the historic humanitarian site review. Every page quietly pointed toward the same conclusion. One supporting authorization still remained missing. During 28 years supervising construction projects for the Army Corps of Engineers, I learned another lesson that prevented more failed inspections than defective concrete or warped lumber ever could. When every document pointed toward one missing approval, that approval usually carried the only signature everyone still needed. The following morning, Sarah Whitmore arrived carrying a weathered cedar document box. "I've been protecting this for years." "You promised my father." "I promised both of you." Inside rested decades of church correspondence, relief supply inventories, volunteer schedules, letters from farming families who had quietly received help during difficult harvest seasons. Then, one sealed envelope immediately caught my attention. Across the front, my father had written, "Open only if the community relief station is questioned. Not after my death. Not after the barn is restored. After the mission itself is challenged." Sarah quietly lowered her eyes. I hoped that day would never come. Inside rested only one small archive reference card, not the missing authorization, just a preservation number, County Heritage File C11. Driving directly to the county archives, I located File C11, exactly where the catalog indicated. Its shelves contained preservation surveys, agricultural history reports, heritage inspections, and community relief correspondence stretching back more than 40 years. The divider marked C11 stood completely empty. The file had been removed. Not recently, years earlier. For the first time since returning home, disappointment settled more heavily than curiosity. Without the supporting authorization, my father's humanitarian mission appeared incomplete. That afternoon, I quietly attended another Heritage Review Board meeting. Harold Bishop greeted me warmly. "I'm glad you came." I wanted to understand. So do all of us. He smiled toward several architectural drawings displayed around the meeting room. "We simply need consistent preservation standards." Technically honest, emotionally incomplete. Near the end of the meeting, one board member accidentally dropped a thick inspection binder onto the floor. Historic photographs scattered across the room. I bent to help gather them. One image immediately caught my attention. It showed my father standing beside the concealed doorway with local church volunteers carrying wooden crates marked seed grain into the hidden chamber. The date beneath the photograph stopped me. It had been taken nearly 3 years before the county officially recorded the beginning of the community relief station. The humanitarian mission everyone believed had started through the church, had actually begun quietly inside our family barn. Driving home, I realized the missing authorization file and the sealed wall belonged to the same documentary chain. They had always belonged together. Just before sunset, Daniel stopped by carrying a rolled heritage display panel he had discovered while helping organize inspection materials. "I thought Grandpa would have wanted you to see this." The display wasn't finished. Across the bottom, my father had handwritten only 6 words. Final preservation approval, attached before inspection, attached, not filed, not archived, attached. The missing preservation authorization had never been intended to remain inside County Heritage File C11. It had traveled with the original humanitarian preservation presentation. Somewhere before the county inspection, that presentation package still had to exist, and unless I found it in time, the quiet compassion my father built into one hidden wall could disappear beneath one perfectly reasonable heritage decision. I placed the unfinished heritage display panel beside my father's church relief ledger. For the first time since returning home, I stopped thinking about the sealed wall itself. The real mystery had never been the hidden chamber. It was the documentary chain connecting every family my father had quietly helped through it. During 28 years supervising construction projects for the Army Corps of Engineers, I learned one lesson every experienced engineer eventually accepted. One missing approval rarely erased the truth. It simply delayed the moment when every remaining document finally confirmed it. The following morning, Sarah Whitmore called before the county archives opened. "I found something." "The missing authorization?" "No, something even better." Within half an hour, I stood beside her inside the oldest preservation vault beneath the courthouse. Most visitors never knew the room existed. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Agricultural preservation reports, historic property files, church correspondence, community relief documentation reaching back more than 60 years. Sarah unlocked an old oak cabinet tucked into the corner. Across the brass plaque appeared 4 simple words: Historic Relief Archives. Inside rested carefully wrapped presentation packages from every county humanitarian preservation project. Each package contained volunteer rosters, relief inventories, preservation surveys, inspection reports, church correspondence, and historical approvals. Sarah gently lifted one wrapped in faded brown cloth. Across the front, my father had written, "Community Relief Station." My pulse quickened. It was here all along. It had to remain complete. She placed the package carefully upon a long wooden table. Neither of us spoke while I untied the cloth. Inside rested exactly what every earlier clue had quietly described. The original Community Relief Preservation Package. Not one document, an entire documentary chain. The building permits, church correspondence, volunteer commitments, relief distribution ledgers, historic preservation surveys, county inspection records. Every document naturally confirmed the next. Nothing depended upon memory anymore. Nothing depended upon assumptions. Then I reached the page every previous clue had quietly pointed toward. Final humanitarian preservation authorization. The authorization explained that the hidden chamber inside our family barn would permanently remain the confidential collection point for church relief supplies, allowing struggling farm families to receive food, seed grain, warm clothing, livestock medicine, and emergency assistance privately without public embarrassment. The wall had never been protecting empty space. It had been protecting dignity. Track A quietly became Track B. The construction sketch, the timber receipts, the farm journals, the preservation surveys, the church relief ledger, the inspection records, Every clue now formed one complete documentary chain. Nothing relied upon opinions anymore. Nothing relied upon incomplete memories. Then Sarah quietly handed me one final sealed envelope. The Preservation Board asked me to wait until today. Across the front, my father had written only one sentence: open only after the documentary chain is complete again. I carefully unfolded the letter. Benjamin, if you're reading this, then you already know the hidden chamber was never built to hide supplies from people. It existed to protect people from shame. Every family who walked through that doorway deserved help without becoming a public story. If sealing the wall one day allows the mission itself to survive instead of the room, please let the wall remain closed. Compassion lasts longer than lumber. For several long moments, I couldn't continue reading. Sarah quietly looked toward the courthouse window. I never wanted you to believe Daniel had erased your father's work. I know. We simply couldn't explain everything until every document belonged together again. Technically complete, emotionally true. That afternoon, I attended the final Heritage Review Board meeting before the county inspection. Harold Bishop greeted me with the same confident smile. I'm glad everything finally makes sense. So am I. He believed the supporting authorization had disappeared decades earlier. He believed the sealed wall would quietly lose its historical protection. I thanked everyone politely, returned every document to the presentation package, and left without revealing what I had found. For the first time since walking back into my restored barn, I willingly allowed everyone to believe the hidden chamber had become nothing more than another sealed wall. Only my father had understood years earlier. Sometimes the strongest way to preserve a community's greatest act of compassion was allowing everyone else to believe the wall itself no longer mattered. The county courthouse filled long before the heritage inspection officially began. Farm families quietly gathered beside historians, preservation volunteers, church members, and county officials. Large photographs of historic barns lined the meeting hall. Architectural drawings rested neatly across long tables. Everything looked exactly the way a formal heritage review should, except for one thing. The future of my family's barn still depended upon one sealed wall. Harold Bishop stood confidently beside the inspection display, reviewing the county's final recommendations. Updated preservation standards, revised inspection procedures, simplified historical classifications. Everything appeared organized. Everything appeared professionally justified. Until he reached the final recommendation. The north interior partition lacks sufficient historical authorization. Without proper documentation, the sealed section cannot receive permanent heritage protection. Technically convincing, emotionally incomplete. The chairman of the Heritage Commission looked across the crowded room. Before we vote, does anyone wish to respond? I quietly stood, not dramatically, not hurriedly, just calmly enough that every conversation gradually faded away. I do. Harold smiled politely. I expected you might. He believed the missing authorization had disappeared decades earlier. He believed no complete documentary chain still existed. I carried the weathered community relief preservation package to the front display table, then removed only one document, the original humanitarian preservation authorization. My father established this relief station under an officially recognized county and church preservation agreement. Harold nodded respectfully. One authorization alone doesn't establish continuing historical significance. You're right, I smiled gently. That's why it isn't the only document. One by one, I placed every record across the table. The original construction sketch, building permits, timber purchase receipts, farm journals, church relief ledgers, volunteer correspondence, county preservation surveys, historic inspection reports. Every document naturally confirmed the next. No speeches, only evidence. Harold tried one final objection. The supporting authorization was never archived. No. I quietly opened the final folder. It wasn't archived. It remained inside the original community relief preservation package, exactly where my father instructed it should remain. The final humanitarian preservation authorization rested before everyone inside the courthouse. Every signature remained intact. County commissioners, church leaders, agricultural preservation officials, and my father. The room became completely silent. Harold stared at the authorization for several long moments. "I've never seen this document," the Heritage Commission chairman answered before I could. "It has always existed. It simply was never intended to be separated from the complete preservation package." Technically true, emotionally decisive. Harold slowly lowered his eyes. The certainty that had carried him through months of planning quietly disappeared. No dramatic confession followed. None was necessary. The documentary chain had already answered every important question. The county attorney carefully reviewed every page, then compared the authorization with the building permits, church records, timber receipts, farm journals, and preservation surveys. Finally, she closed the final folder. The community relief station qualifies for permanent historical protection. The Carter Barn, including the sealed north wall, shall remain a protected humanitarian heritage site. Silence filled the room. Then applause slowly spread throughout the courthouse. Not for me, not for the paperwork, for every family my father had quietly protected without asking for recognition. Daniel walked toward me, holding something in his hand. "I wanted to tell you everything, I know. But Grandpa made me promise. And he was right." He gently placed an old iron key into my palm, the same heavy key that had once opened the concealed doorway before the wall was sealed. "I kept it because he said one day you'd understand." I slowly turned the worn key over. On its rusted brass tag, my father had stamped 6 simple words. "Compassion leaves stronger foundations than timber." For the first time since returning home, I finally understood why the wall had been sealed. It had never existed to hide a room. It had quietly protected the dignity of every neighbor who once entered that barn needing help, and left believing no one would ever know. The morning after the county heritage designation became official, I walked back to the old barn alone. Not because I still believed it belonged only to my family, because some places deserve one quiet visit. After finally telling the truth, Daniel met me at the doorway without saying a word. Morning sunlight filtered through the restored rafters. Fresh-cut pine blended with the familiar scent of weathered oak and dry hay. The sealed north wall stood exactly where it always had. Only this time, Daniel quietly reached into his pocket. "I think it's yours now." He placed the old iron key into my hand, the same key my father had carried for decades. For several long moments, I simply held it. Then Daniel knelt beside one weathered support post near the sealed wall. He gently removed a small wooden cap I had never noticed before. Hidden beneath it rested a narrow iron box. The wall remained sealed, exactly as my father intended. The key had never belonged to the wall. It belonged to the box. Inside, there were no deeds, no money, no family treasure. Only one faded photograph, one handwritten letter, and dozens of neatly tied thank you notes. The photograph showed my father standing outside the barn beside several neighboring farm families after an especially difficult winter. No one posed proudly, no speeches, just tired people quietly smiling. I untied the stack of letters. Some thanked an anonymous church volunteer for seed grain. Others remembered warm blankets arriving before the first snowfall. One widow simply wrote, "You helped us keep the farm without anyone knowing we needed help." Near the bottom rested one sealed envelope addressed to me. I unfolded the letter. "Benjamin, if you are reading this, then the wall has already done its final job. It protected people's dignity until the story itself became strong enough to stand without the room behind it." I smiled before continuing. "Never measure this barn by its lumber. Measure it by the number of families who left, believing they still had their pride. Buildings eventually grow old. Quiet kindness never does." I folded the letter slowly. Daniel stood beside me. "So that's what Grandpa wanted us to preserve." I nodded. "He never asked us to save a room. He asked us to protect a promise." A month later, the county officially dedicated the Carter Barn as the permanent home of the Community Relief Heritage exhibit. Visitors still admire the restored beams. Children still ask about the old sealed wall. But the exhibit everyone remembers most isn't hidden behind lumber. It's the collection of anonymous letters written by families whose lives were quietly changed by neighbors who never asked for recognition. Before leaving that morning, my grandson, Caleb, placed one blank card inside the iron box. Across the top, he carefully wrote, "The next family we help." I looked at him. "Already planning ahead?" He smiled. "Grandpa started it. You kept it alive. I just don't want it to stop." If this story reminded you that the strongest legacy is never the structure we leave behind, but the quiet compassion we build into the lives of others, thank you for sharing this journey. May your kindness become someone else's safe place. May your generosity always protect another person's dignity. And may every foundation you strengthen continue supporting hope long after your own work is finished.